climate change. But there are still questions about whether afforestation always does this. And this is something that I want to actually deal with. There's also issues about the effects of afforestation on other major greenhouse gas emissions, which are largely ignored, although in recent years there's been a bit more emphasis, particularly on methane fluxes and the effects of afforestation on methane fluxes. And the whole issue about all of this is, do we really know enough about these land use related mitigation actions to make this a viable approach for these new circular systems? The kind of focus that we often have in terms of afforestation is largely based on the removal of trees and the effects of the removal of trees actually on carbon sequestration. And this actually highlights the effect of removing trees on soil carbon sequestration. And I've tried to highlight the major figures to focus on in the red dashed boxes. And you can see that going from a native forest, this is in Chile, although the actual agricultural systems in this area are very similar to many of the systems in Northern Europe. But going from the native forest, removing the native forest, you see that there's about a 60% reduction in soil carbon associated with this. Now, the question really is, can we, by planting trees, can we, by planting trees, restore the actual levels of carbon that we might actually see in these afforested systems? And I think actually the question really is related to where we actually plant the trees, because in some situations we actually find that there is I've gone the wrong way now. In some situations we actually find that far from increasing carbon sequestration, afforestation might even reduce soil carbon sequestration. And I'll show that in the next slide. But in this slide, the actual dark histograms, the filled histograms, relate to the situation before afforestation, and the open histograms relate to the situation after afforestation. And really you can focus on the 4.2b inset, and you can see that afforestation with conifers, a mixed forest or a broadleaf forest, in this situation in Ireland, doesn't seem to have any impact whatsoever on soil carbon sequestration. And this relates to about, I think there was over 20 sites were actually sampled in this analysis. And this actually shows that there's no real impact of afforestation on soil carbon sequestration. The age of the forest also doesn't seem to have an impact either. Irrespective of the age of the forest, you can also see that there's very little evidence for an increase in carbon sequestration. And also the initial land cover prior to afforestation also doesn't seem to have an effect on soil carbon sequestration. So in this particular example, afforestation in Ireland doesn't, on the basis of these results, have any significant impact on soil carbon sequestration. And rather surprisingly, some recent analyses have actually suggested that afforestation, have actually shown that afforestation actually decreases soil carbon sequestration. So in each of these panels, the darker kind of brown colors indicate the actual below ground carbon in the soil. And you can actually, I think you can see generally that in all the examples, there's a reduction in below ground carbon. Now, it's not always significant, but there is actually, in some cases, the first example there, the 12 years old Balogi site, there is actually a significant reductions in soil carbon. But there's a trend in each of these examples for a reduction in soil carbon sequestration. And the other thing about this is that even though there's an increase in above ground carbon, which is the green coloration on each of these examples, there's a reduction in one case of ecosystem carbon, the total carbon associated with above and below ground carbon. So in this case, not only does it result in a reduction in soil carbon, but it also results in a reduction in ecosystem carbon. The other thing about afforestation that really hasn't been looked at in any great detail is the effect on other greenhouse gas emissions. We've always focused on carbon sequestration, and we haven't really considered the likely impact on the other two major greenhouse gas emissions. And this example actually shows that there can be quite varied effects on both methane, that's B, and also nitrous oxide emissions associated with afforestation. The interesting thing with afforestation is that there's often significant uptake of methane, and this is something that we're actually exploring in the ReLive project. In terms of nitrous oxide emissions, we actually compiled a data set a few years ago looking at reported values for nitrous oxide emissions associated with afforestation. And we actually found a very wide range of values. And in some cases, the values associated with afforestation were actually very similar to the kind of values you might actually get in a cropland. So these are not insignificant. And these are things that we should really start to look at to actually get a better picture of the effect of afforestation used for offsetting carbon emissions on other greenhouse gases, particularly nitrous oxide emission. I want to move on now to something, a related topic, which also has a significant impact on the use of land use changes on climate change mitigation or offsetting. And this comes from an advert in a newspaper early this year. And this was emphasizing one of the initiatives associated with afforestation of dryland, particularly dryland regions. And at first sight, it looks actually very good, because we can see that if we have an increase in afforestation or an increase in grassland productivity, we get an increase in carbon sequestration. But whether or not that really leads to an increase in cooling, as the advert suggests, is actually questionable. And this is what I want to deal with the last part of the presentation. So inevitably, any land use change will result in a change in something called albedo. Now, I'll say a little bit more about albedo after I've gone through a couple of slides. But looking at this example, the colors are not actually represented particularly well, but I think you should be able to get the main picture. So if you look at the forest, there's a lot less reflection from the forest. It's darker than the grassland areas. And you can even see the semi-natural grassland down in the kind of bottom right-hand part of the picture. The semi-natural grassland can actually be distinguished from some of the improved grassland. It's a much lighter color, a higher reflectance than the improved grassland, and certainly a higher reflectance than that of the forest. So inevitably, any land use change has a biophysical effect related to the reflectance of radiation back into space. We also can see the same if we look at management activities. So this is an example from a system in Africa where they've used conventional tilling, CT, non-inversion tilling, sorry, conventional tillage, non-inversion tillage, and non-inversion tillage plus mulching. And the figures indicate the reflectance or the albedo associated with each of those systems. And you can see that there's a change in albedo associated with these different management practices. So why should we really bother about albedo? Well, I touched on this already, but basically the albedo is a measure of the amount of, or the proportion of radiation reflected back into space. And we should bother about this because the more that's reflected back into space, the less the warming effect. The less that's actually reflected back into space, the greater the warming effects. The problem really is that if we actually have something that increases carbon sequestration, the likelihood is it will reduce the albedo. And the question then is, in turn, whether or not that effect of albedo more than counteracts any benefits associated with increased carbon sequestration. This actually shows just the main part of this figure is the thing to focus on, the relationship between NEP, productivity, and albedo. And what you can actually see there is that as the albedo decreases, the productivity goes up. It's probably a better way of saying this is to say that if we increase the productivity of the system, it almost inevitably results in a reduction in albedo. And again, the question is whether or not that albedo effect, which can lead to a warming, more than compensates for the benefits associated with increases in carbon sequestration. This is an example of an analysis done a year or so ago. And what it shows is that if we afforest dryland areas, even though we could benefit in terms of carbon sequestration, because of the albedo effect, in many of these areas, we get a warming. So the dark red is a significant warming, and the kind of orange color is a warming effect. So in many of these dryland areas, if we planted trees, the model projections indicate that we would in large part get a warming rather than a cooling that we might expect based on an enhanced carbon sequestration. What we have actually done recently is to look at the regional effects of this, because an albedo change in one area is not going to have the same effect as an albedo change in another area. And what it shows is that in areas where there's limited cloud cover, the effect of an albedo change is going to be more pronounced than in other areas. So it kind of looks here, if we look at the right-hand picture, which actually shows cloud cover, it looks there as if in much of Europe, we won't actually have really that much of an effect of an albedo change, although this is a very coarse analysis and it doesn't really give the fine detail that we would actually need. But in other areas, particularly the dryland areas of Africa, Central Australia, for instance, parts of Southwest Africa, that in these areas, an albedo change is likely to have a much, much greater effect than it might actually have in other areas. Okay, so to finish, just to sum up some of the points that I've actually tried to make, afforestation may not be the panacea that many people actually think. The other point about this is too that in many cases, because it increases the amount of above ground carbon, then afforestation may actually make the carbon more vulnerable to extreme events, which is something else that perhaps actually needs to be considered. And I think there needs to be more consideration of the two other major greenhouse gases that are associated with land use change, particularly afforestation, that's methane and nitrous oxide. And I think all in all, it means that we have to be very careful about where we use afforestation and other land use changes if we are actually going to achieve the objectives that we actually set out. And I think, again, we need a better understanding of albedo effects. And there are also other biophysical effects, which I haven't mentioned, associated with land use changes, which also could counteract the effects of an enhanced carbon sequestration. And what I want to do is just to finish with the people who've actually contributed to some of this work and the funders associated with the work as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Osborne. That was a very interesting presentation. I just want to remind everyone that you can put your question in the Q&A section and also in the chat. I just saw a question in the chat. It says, Professor, do you have any date? I imagine it's data about a tree and oxygen production quantity. I'm not really sure if I understand that question.
Well, I know that oxygen is a byproduct of photosynthesis, and the trees have actually been used in some situations for oxygen production, but I'm not quite sure about the quantitative amounts of oxygen released by trees.
Yeah, I imagine maybe they're asking about
doesn't really answer the question, but
yeah, it's okay. Let's see in the Q&A.
Should I stop sharing?
Oh yeah, sure. So I do have a question. So I would say, like, in your opinion, what do you think it would be the best agricultural practices, like in an ideal scenario? I know there is like a lot of variables to take into account. Well, what do you think it could be like good agricultural practices in conjunction to mitigate a bit the emission of greenhouse gases?
I think the certainly the focus in Europe has been on using land use modifications to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to mitigate climate change. I think the question is whether or not that kind of focus will actually reduce the greenhouse gas emissions to the extent that we actually need to reduce them. And I think there's been a few people who've suggested that these land use modifications may in themselves not actually get us to the kind of targets that we want to reach.
Yeah, you're right. Okay, we have a question here in the chat. It says, can you elaborate a bit more on the effect of methane emission in connection with afforestation?
In many situations, afforestation results in an uptake of methane. So there's quite well documented information showing variable effects of afforestation on methane uptake, not emissions. And I know that when we started off making these kinds of measurements, we often ignored the values that we got if they were negative, assuming they were in error. But actually, all of the recent evidence indicates that forests can take up significant amounts of methane. Now, this is actually quite good because obviously in the use of livestock, methane becomes a much more dominant part of the greenhouse gas budget. So if we could use afforestation both for increasing carbon sequestration and reducing methane emissions, that would actually be quite good. But I don't think we know enough still about the ability of forests to take up methane. So we would need more information actually on that. And actually, it is actually one of the, as I said, is one of the objectives of the Relive project, to get a better understanding of the factors controlling methane uptake by forest ecosystems.
Okay. We have another question here. It says, thank you for an very interesting presentation. It says, from space, colleagues have also been looking at Just Dig It. Maybe then there is a link there. There it showed land surface temperature shows a cooling effect where the bunds were dug. What do you think of studies like this?
I don't know the work, so I'm not sure whether the cooling effect includes the albedo effect, or whether it simply includes the effect associated with carbon sequestration. Of course, if we only include carbon sequestration, it must actually result in a cooling effect. But if we look at the effects of albedo, it may not actually result in a cooling effect. And the study that I showed you that looked at dryland areas of the world, which showed that in many cases that there would be a warming effect rather than the expected cooling effect associated with afforestation, would suggest that in many cases albedo effects can counteract any benefits associated with carbon sequestration.
We have another question. It says, you mentioned about carbon sequestration. Are you familiar with the carbon fractions or fractionations, particulate and mineral bound carbon, and how are you dealing with it in measuring carbon storage and sequestration?
Yes, I'm familiar with it. I'm familiar with it, and this is something that we're looking at in relation to carbon sequestration in soils in another project called the True Soil Project, which is another ERANET project. So in this study, we're looking at systems where a system which accumulates carbon and has been steadily accumulating carbon since the 1970s, and the intention is to partition between POM and MAM in order to actually look at the roles of particulate and mineral associated carbon, and whether in fact one of these fractions has a greater impact on carbon sequestration in these systems than the other.
We have a question in the Q&A. So Professor Osborne, Tim Reed asks, is the reduction in soil carbon sequestration due to afforestation in Ireland related possibly to a high carbon level in Irish grassland or crop soils prior to afforestation?
The reduction in carbon sequestration, the example that I gave, comes from Scotland. So it relates to an afforestation program that was carried out on a Kaluna heath podsolic soils some time ago, and the reduction in soil carbon sequestration actually seen in that example has been attributed to a so-called priming effect. So the introduction of trees with a slightly different mycorrhiza is proposed to have made more carbon available to soil microbes, and essentially when they finish that carbon they start to eat native carbon. So this is a kind of a simplified description of the priming effect, but the priming effect is the reason why soil carbon sequestration has declined in response to afforestation in these systems. Now, obviously, concrete evidence that this is the mechanism associated with the reduction in soil carbon sequestration still needs to be found.
So we have another question. I think this is going to be the last one. Federico Dragoni asks, you show that afforestation can cause negative changes in soil carbon compared with moorland and shrubs like heather. Probably similar could be observing carbon-rich grasslands and other ecosystems. What about carbon-poor croplands, like many common croplands in Europe?
Yeah, I think this relates to something that I mentioned about targeting the areas where we use afforestation. So it is possible that if we actually use afforestation on some croplands, which could be less than 2% carbon, that we would get benefits in terms of carbon sequestration. Whereas if we planted forests in other circumstances, then we might not actually get those benefits. But I don't think it's actually quite as straightforward as that, because the example from the Scottish example that I showed, showing a decrease in soil carbon sequestration, those would be relatively high carbon containing soils. So there are other mechanisms, I think, associated with afforestation that could impact on soil carbon sequestration that perhaps we still don't know enough about.
That's perfect. Professor Osborne, this is the time that we have for questions. There are some other questions in the chat, but maybe somebody's asking if you have some published work. Maybe they could get in contact with you somehow. Thank you very much, Professor Osborne. Yes.
Can I answer in the chat? Or
yeah. You can type.
That is possible.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. Thank you very much for joining us and for letting for showing us the results of your multiple projects. And thank you everyone for your questions. And next we're gonna continue with Professor Martin van Ittersum. So give me 1 second, I'll share my screen really quick. There you go. Great. There you go. Professor Martin van Ittersum is currently a professor of plant production systems at Wageningen University. He is also a visiting professor at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences in Uppsala and is currently leading the Global Giftgald Atlas project that maps the scope for increasing agricultural production on current agricultural land. His research focuses mainly on projects that deal with global food availability, integrated assessment of agricultural systems, yield gap analysis, phosphorus scarcity, climate change, and circular food systems. Today, Professor Martin van Ittersum is entitled, his talk is entitled 3 Principles of Circularity and Applications, which is part of Me Bicycle project. Professor Martin van Ittersum, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to present. And I'm just gonna stop sharing my screen, and now the floor is all yours. Thank you so much. You can start sharing your screen.
Thank you very much, Evelyn.
No, yes.
I go to the start. All right. Well, good morning, afternoon. I also saw people, I think, from Asia. So
yes,
perhaps you're already later in the day. Good day, everyone. It's a pleasure to say something. It's only a short talk, of course, to say something about a number of principles that we developed over the past years related to circular food systems, circular agricultural systems. So I want to introduce these principles and give some illustrations of research we did around these principles. And of course, this is all related to the fact that our present food system has very significant impacts on the environment and on natural resource. And this is the share that, this is in green, the share that the food system is taking in some of the environmental issues that we're facing on our planet. And the darker green part of the bars shows the share of the animal sourced food, ASF, animal sourced food. So you can see the role of our food systems on land use, acidification, eutrophication, etc., and also the prominent role that is taken by the production of animal sourced food, the production and consumption, I should say. This is not just about production, it's the food system, so it's production and consumption. So the key question is really how to produce food while respecting the planet, staying within planetary boundaries. And then often a footprint approach is very popular and is proposed. And that can follow 2 tracks. It can follow a production track and say, okay, how can we produce with less impact? Or it can follow a consumption track. How can we eat with less impact? So talking about producing with less impact, and I'll take the example of producing a livestock product. That can be cheese, it can be milk, it can be a chicken meat, it can be beef, whatever. So if we want to produce with less impact, we generally focus on having a high productivity of the herd. So produce as much eggs or meat per unit of feed as possible. Now, if that is the aim, if that is the target, then usually we realize that with very nutrient dense feed, with high quality feed. But if we do that, and we will probably give the animals cereals, grain, with a high nutrient density and a good conversion, we will enter the feed food competition, because the cereals that we're feeding to the animals might as well serve as food for human beings directly. On the other hand, if we follow the consumption track and want to consume with less impact, you might argue, okay, we better eat chicken and no beef, because that has a lower consumption footprint. That may be true, but again, the chicken that we then consume, that we would then prefer, is usually also fed with cereals. So again, there might be feed competition, whereas the beef that is produced is often raised on grassland and consuming all kinds of residue products that we as human beings cannot consume directly. And if you go for the vegan track, so no animal products at all, then the question is, what do we do with our co-products, such as straw, such as residues from the food system that we could feed to animals, but that we cannot consume as human beings? And what do we do with our grassland in the world? Because animals can graze on the grassland, they can produce milk, can produce cheese, can produce beef, while we as human beings cannot use the grassland directly for our food production. So with that in mind, I would argue that a footprint approach alone does not address sufficiently the interactions that are at stake within the food system to properly address how we can improve environmental performance of our agriculture and our food system. And that was really at stake. Some of you may know that we had elections in our country yesterday, and I'm really still trying to digest the result, and I must say I'm not very happy about it. But just prior to the elections, one of the leading national newspapers approached me with a statement from one of our political parties. Yes, the Party of the Animals. So it's a very green party, very much in favor of reducing livestock production and consumption, and very much concerned about the climate for very good reasons all. But one of their statements was, on every hectare on which we currently produce feed for cows, pigs or chickens, we can feed 4 times more people if we produce food for human beings directly. So it's obviously referring to the feed food competition. So we should not produce beautiful wheat and feed it to our cows or pigs or chickens, but we better produce that wheat for human beings directly, baking bread or other products. So the question was whether I could basically verify that statement and explain whether that is correct or not. Now, it's not as simple as it looks like, perhaps, at first hand, because there is these many interactions that I just explained within the food system. So we really need to take a food system's perspective, producing the biomass, the livestock in the system, and how that's basically benefits from biomass or from byproducts, the consumption of products by human beings, the processing in all kinds of factories of our biomass products to make it suitable for either human consumption or to use byproducts for the livestock sector. So some years back, we, as a kind of hypothesis, my colleague from Animal Production Systems, Imke de Boer, and I developed 3 guiding principles to make our agriculture and food systems more circular. And these are the 3 principles that we proposed. So the first one is, if we're talking about good agricultural land, then we should produce food for human beings rather than produce feed for animals. That's much more efficient and will lead to a lower impact on the environment. The conversion through animals to nice products that we like always comes with conversion losses. There's one but here. That priority is only possible, useful, sensible, if the land is indeed of good quality and we can produce crops for human consumption. Some of the land is simply only suitable for grassland, for various reasons. And then, of course, there is no alternative. And if we want to use that land for food production, then livestock production is the only possibility. The second principle is, of course, first of all, we should avoid waste and losses. That's the, let's say, avoid principle. But some losses and some waste will not be, that cannot be avoided. And in that case, we have to reuse these products. We have to recycle these byproducts or these co-products in a sensible manner with the right prioritization. And I'll come back to that later. And the third principle is that, yes, there can be a role for livestock and animals, I believe. Of course, you can have ethical reasons why we don't want that, but let's put these reasons aside. Just from an environmental and resource use perspective, there can be a very useful role for animals in the system, and that is to convert human inedible biomass into food. And I'm talking about grass, I'm talking about straw, I'm talking about husk, I'm talking about all kinds of byproducts from the food system that we as human beings cannot consume directly. So briefly about each of these principles. First one, the priority to biomass for human consumption. That's obviously referring to the feed-food competition. So currently some 40% of the global cropland area and also indeed close to 40% of the cereal production in the world is going to the livestock sector as feed and not being used for baking bread or other kinds of products for human consumption. So this principle is really referring to that issue. Biomass and production resources are used most effectively if we use it directly for human consumption. As I said, not all of the land is suitable for that, so that has to be taken into account. That second principle, recycle co-products back into the system, the co-products that cannot be avoided because they simply come with producing crops or with processing products in our industry or with food waste or food losses. Recycle these back in the system with a right prioritization. And I would argue it's largely an hypothesis also, but there are good reasons for this hypothesis, is that the first priority should always be to maintain our soils and keep the soil in a good quality, give back enough organic matter to maintain the balance at least, and have good fertility of our soils, because that's the basis of our food production. But we also may use some of the byproducts as feed for animals and to produce beautiful products, animal proteins basically. Or we could use it as fertilizer, manure for instance, and that can be processed manure, it can be manure directly used as fertilizer, it could be used for anaerobic digestion to produce energy and a co-product which is fertilizer. And a final destination might be just to use the byproducts to increase the soil carbon sequestration, and that relates to the previous talk of Professor Osborne. The question is, however, how effective and efficient is that to use biomass for that purpose? I would put it as a lowest priority, honestly, because it requires a lot of biomass every year again to maintain a certain increased level of biomass in our soils. We might be better off in using that biomass for other purposes, as illustrated here, and in that way saving more greenhouse gas emissions than by simply stocking it in our soils. That doesn't mean that we should not put any carbon in our soils, just to maintain the soil fertility and the soil quality. The third principle is this one. It's to use animals in our food system in a sensible manner. You can show that if we want to produce a certain amount of animal protein per person per day, and in Northwest Europe we're consuming around 50 to 60 grams of animal protein per person per day at the moment, that requires a lot of land simply to produce the feed and to convert that feed into these livestock proteins, animal proteins. But it is not true that absolutely no animal protein leads to the lowest land use or the lowest nitrogen use or the lowest phosphorus use. Indeed, the minimum is probably at a very modest level of animal protein consumption, around 10 to 20 grams of animal protein. That would lead to the lowest resource use and probably also lowest emissions. And that is simply for the reason that at this level, we actually make use of the straw and the residues and the grass to produce animal products that we as human beings can consume. At this level, zero animal protein, what do we do with the residues? What do we do with the grass? And what do we do with other byproducts from the food system? Nothing in fact to produce food. So then we can only use it, for instance, for energy production or other purposes. So that's the reasoning why a modest level of livestock production in the food system, just to upgrade the low opportunity cost biomass from the food system. Use animals for what they're good at, and also benefit from co-products that these animals may produce, like fertilizers and other ecosystem services that they deliver. So in the last part of my presentation, I want to give some examples of research we did around these three principles. And the first one is about the role of livestock in our food system and feeding them with low opportunity biomass. These are pictures from a large poultry farm producing eggs, just 2 kilometers from where I'm living, in the middle of the country, in the middle of the Netherlands. And these chickens are fed entirely, exclusively with byproducts from the food system. So broken biscuits and all kinds of products that basically are byproducts or waste products from the food system, not used anymore for food consumption, but are used as feed to feed the chicken. Now, one of my PhD candidates who will shortly in January actually defend his PhD, Ben van Selm, he developed a model for the European Union plus the United Kingdom and tried to estimate whether feeding livestock in this manner, not just to produce eggs, but also pork and beef and other products, feeding them with byproducts from the food system, is that possible, and will that lead to sufficient animal protein production consistent with probably a diet that you all have heard of, the Eat Lancet diet, which is a diet much lower in livestock products, but a healthy and sustainable diet proposed by the Eat Lancet Commission. Now, indeed, it shows, that study, that this is possible. This is the 100% Eat Lancet situation. So according to the Eat Lancet reference diet. And you see that overall, across all the animal products, it's possible with the three circular scenarios to produce enough animal proteins. But for specific products, like here for fish, the blue scenario, or for eggs here, the green and the blue scenario is not enough production of those categories. But for others, like pork here, there's actually far more than 100% of the requirement. So adding it all up, there is enough livestock protein production in these kind of circular systems, but for specific products we have an underproduction, and for other products we have an overproduction. So the composition is an issue. So recommended animal protein levels of the Eat Lancet diet can be met, but the precise dietary guidelines of the Eat Lancet diet cannot be met at European level. So Ben, in his further chapters in his thesis, developed a food system optimization model to minimize environmental criteria and to maximize productivity. And he assumed certain diets for a fixed population, so to feed a fixed number of people in a country. And he distinguished in his model some 50 crops and a handful of livestock systems. And he applied that to the Netherlands just as an illustration. So the Netherlands, with a population of close to 18 million people, assuming different diets for these 18 million people, and then trying to minimize the environmental impact, or to produce as much food as possible. So using that model, I will give a few illustrations of what has the largest impact on environmental criteria, taking into account circular principles. So the main impact on land use and greenhouse gas emissions, those are the two environmental criteria here that were optimized by Ben van Selm. And it shows that shifting the diets, moderating our livestock product consumption, really has the biggest influence. It reduces land use by 40% for the Netherlands here, and it halves the greenhouse gas emissions. Also, a substantial impact has changing the imports and exports. So the Netherlands is an exporting country. So in that sense, a lot of the production and the footprint that is made by agriculture and food production can be mitigated by reducing the export or changing the types of products that we export. And finally, just feeding livestock with byproducts, food waste, for instance, from the system, has only a small influence on land use and greenhouse gas emissions. It also tells that it's really the interaction of these three factors that will make the difference. It's because it's, of course, changing the diets has a major influence, but it will not be an easy thing to change within a country, certainly not in the short term. So we'll also have to look at the other aspects together. Just to continue a little bit on this application for the Netherlands, and I think it can be illustrated for other parts of the world, including China, for instance, and other livestock intensive countries. This diagram, which is a bit too complicated to explain in detail, it shows the nitrogen flows in our system. But these ones here are the two main inputs: the amount of concentrates entering the Netherlands from abroad, so import of feed, basically. 400 million kilograms of nitrogen is in it. And this is the use of fertilizer nitrogen in our food system, almost 200 million kilograms. The output is only half of that, roughly. So close to 200 in livestock products, so half of the concentrates, and the sales of crop products, roughly half of the mineral fertilizer use. So there's a 50%, let's say, use efficiency of the nitrogen in our system, and the other 50% is basically lost to the environment, or is stocking up, piling up in our system. And that comes back in the manure problem that we're facing in our country. And the colors here are the density of manure nitrogen or manure phosphorus production in our country, and you can recognize, those that know the Netherlands, but otherwise you just have to believe me, these are the livestock dense areas in the country. So there's a huge surplus of nitrogen and phosphorus in the areas where we have a lot of livestock. So one of our hypotheses, and that is really the final part of my presentation, that we tested in the work of Ben van Selm, is what happens if we re-establish a link between feed production and livestock production. So stopping the feed import from abroad and only raising livestock in the country by producing the feed within the country. So this is the current situation, with the ship symbolizing a huge import of feed into the country, and then producing a lot of livestock products that are partly exported again to other parts of Europe. And this is the new situation where we have no import, no ship entering the country with feed, and we reduce the exports of livestock products, and only to the extent that it comes with the production of other products, and recouple feed production in the country with livestock production. Now, here are some results of that analysis, again with the same model that I've introduced a few slides ago, and here it shows how that reduces the protein exports from livestock products the reference situation to the recoupling situation, the recoupling of feed production and livestock production. So a drastic reduction of protein export. The consumption in our national diet doesn't change. So this was assuming the same diet as today. And we can still produce enough eggs, dairy products, and meat products in the food system by producing our own feed. But obviously, it will have a large influence on the types of products that can be exported. A lot of export of eggs and meat in the current situation, but it will go back to zero in the new situation. And there will still be a very substantial export of dairy products. At the same time, we can reduce many environmental impacts with this new recoupling scenario. Ammonia emission, methane emission, N2O, the acidification potential, global warming potential, they are all much lower in the recouple scenario versus the reference scenario. Now, this is just a black and white reference recouple scenario comparison. He also compared some more complicated scenarios in which food competition was avoided, but I don't have the time to explain all this. But I think it gives you the idea of what can be done with such a food system model. To conclude, circularity, I think, is a way forward to improve the environmental performance of our food system. An important question is, at which level do we try to implement circularity? Currently, it's really at a global level, you could argue. We transport feed from all over the world, for instance, to the Netherlands, and we export then again livestock products. Well, these kind of things happen with many products across the globe. I think there is some consensus, at least among many people, that we have to close cycles, or better close cycles, at lower level, not necessarily at farm level, because then we're going back to the past, where farms have livestock and crops on their own farm. Maybe that's not needed and not the most effective way, but really to close cycles much better at regional and country level. And I've shown an example here of studies for the Netherlands. And with that, I welcome your questions, and I like to enter the discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor van Ittersum. Let's see if there is a question here. It says, Professor van Ittersum, would you suggest that we use the land that is not good for growing human food to produce livestock product, or should we try our best to restore the land? Thank you.
Yeah, good question, and an obvious question, I think. I think that very much depends on the question whether we still want to produce livestock products. Because, of course, these grasslands, or these lower quality croplands even, where we can only produce feed, we can use them to produce beautiful dairy products, cheese, chicken and eggs, and all kinds of meat products, sorry. But whether we want it or not is a societal and ethical question. So I don't have the answer for that. I personally still enjoy a little bit of livestock products, I must say. I very much enjoy my piece of cheese, and for that we might use some of our grassland, of course. Whether we need to use let's say 3 billion hectares of grassland for that purpose, that could be another question.
I have a question. So, do you think, like, in the Netherlands, are there, like, with the existing policies, are there policies that are preventing maybe the farmers from using an integrated system, like among farmers, let's say exchange manure for crops, and like, are there like any policies that really prevent them to freely exchange these goods?
No, there are no policies that really prevent them, unless, I mean, there's regulations as to the amount of manure that you can use on your land. So there's always a maximum, there's a limit to that because of emissions and leakage to the groundwater. But apart from that, there is no limitations. So, and there is actually quite a bit of exchange of manure from livestock farmers to crop farmers, and also of feed or byproducts from arable farmers to livestock farmers. That is occurring, but probably still not enough, not at a sufficient level. It could be improved a lot. And there is also some spatial, let's say, disaggregation. So the livestock, as I showed on the map, is in certain areas. The crop farmers are elsewhere. Now, we're in a small country, that helps. But of course, in many places on the planet, there is quite a separation of livestock production and of crop production, which makes it much more difficult to exchange products.
We have another question from Matthew. It says, does Ittersum, your project, outputs include any impacts on soil organic carbon? Because I guess it's important in the optimal circularity scale. Linked with this question, do you think it might be possible and desirable to mix mass flow models like Ittersum with process-based models?
In the current version, we do not calculate the soil carbon content. We can quite easily estimate, let's say, the inputs of organic matter from the different system to the soil, and we probably could also estimate whether that is sufficient to maintain a balance, but we do not model the soil organic carbon content at the moment.
We have a question from Tim Reed. It says, for the reference versus recoupling figures, does that take into account the cost changes in food products? I'd assume that the reason is that the reason so much is imported/exported due to cost rather than anything else. Does the recoupled system produce cheaper food?
Yeah, no, good point. I mean, these models, these analyses that I've shown are really focusing on food production and the environment. The economics is not taken into account in what I've shown today. And yeah, of course, there are very strong economic drivers that allow and that actually stimulate the import of feed from all over the world to the Netherlands, and that we are a large livestock product producer and export those products to other places. So the economic incentives are there to maintain the current system, but at the same time, increasingly we're facing environmental problems, which force us to change that system. Sometimes just because of legislation, European legislation, sometimes also because it increasingly leads to costs that sooner or later will come back to also the consumers and to the citizens of the country. So we'll have to do something with these environmental impacts also from an economic perspective at some stage.
Yes, yeah. Coming from here, I guess we're gonna have this last question. It says, do you think the EU nitrates directive will have the intended impact?
Sorry, can you repeat that question, Elvin?
It says, do you think the EU nitrates directive will have the intended impact?
Well, it has an impact in the sense that the nitrate leaching to the groundwater, for instance, has decreased substantially over the past decades. And in quite for instance, in the Netherlands, in large regions, we do meet the criteria, but also there are still regions, particularly in the southeast of the country, and I'm sure that applies to other countries in Europe as well, where we still exceed the target levels. So it does have an impact, and it will have more impact in the future as well to drive us to meeting the targets everywhere in the country and in Europe. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much, everyone who joined this webinar and joined the discussion. Once again, I would like to thank both Professor Osborne and Professor Van Ittersum for giving us a very insightful presentations in all of their projects. We are almost like we're closing the webinar, and I would like to remind to all of you to register for our fifth and final breakfast club, which is going to be on December 7th at 10 a.m. Central Europe time. And I'll be sending the invitation to all of you in the following days. In that breakfast club, we're going to have Dr. Mark Moraine from INRAE talking about circularity in reintegrated crop livestock systems at a territory level, which are the pathways and limitations. And Dr. Mihaela Balanescu from Beia Consulting, she's going to be talking about challenges and solutions for greenhouse gas emission mitigations for the mixed farming system across different European climates. I'm really sure you're going to enjoy that webinar, and I'm closing this one now. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye, everyone. Thanks so much. We are almost like we're closing the webinar, and I would like to remind all of you to register for our fifth and final breakfast club, which is going to be on December 7th at 10 a.m. Central Europe time. And I'll be sending the invitation to all of you in the following days. In that breakfast club, we're going to have Dr. Mark Moraine from INRAE talking about circularity in reintegrated crop livestock systems at a territory level, which are the pathways and limitations. And Dr. Mihaela Balanescu from Beia Consulting, she's going to be talking about challenges and solutions for greenhouse gas emission mitigations for the mixed farming system across different European climates. I'm really sure you're going to enjoy that webinar, and I'm closing this one now. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye, everyone. Thanks so much. Thank you, Professor Van and Professor Osborne. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you too.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much.
Good rest of the day.
Thank you too. Bye.